The Chicago dawn painted the sky in metallic shades of gray and orange, reflected in the windows of Hale Tower like cold mirrors. At the top of the skyscraper, the Hale twins' penthouse was awake before the city. The distant sound of sirens mingled with the low hum of the ventilation system. Ethan Hale stood, impeccable in his white shirt and tailored trousers, his face turned toward where he knew Lake Michigan was. His raised chin conveyed control, but his left hand, clenched into a fist, betrayed the tension. Evan, seated on the leather sofa, absent-mindedly tapped out a melody on a portable keyboard, a tune only he could hear in its entirety. The space around them felt like a modern temple. Straight lines, blackout curtains, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Their routine was more choreography than life. Marcus Reed entered the room with an iPad in hand, his steps quick and confident. Today's schedule: board meeting at 9, a call with the Boston investors at 11, and an interview with the Wall Street Journal at 4. The car will be ready at 8. Ethan merely nodded, while Evan commented with a touch of humor. Did you schedule any time for breathing in there, Marcus? Or are we just skipping straight to tomorrow? The COO didn't smile. His job was to maintain the pace, not ease tensions. This dance was familiar. Ethan set the tone, Evan softened it, Marcus organized it, but something about that morning felt different. The electricity in the air wasn't just from the strong coffee. It was exactly at 6:12 a.m. that the sound of the elevator announced the arrival of the new housekeeper. Grace Alvarez stepped into the hall, wearing a simple uniform and carrying a small bag. Her eyes swept the room discreetly, registering the minimalist furniture, the controlled silence, the way each team member moved as if on a stage. "Good morning," she said, her voice low but firm. Evan responded first, smiling slightly. "Finally, someone who doesn't seem like a robot around here." Ethan said nothing. He just tilted his head, evaluating the timbre of the new voice that had just entered his world. Grace was quickly briefed by the head assistant, but she didn't miss the chance to observe the twins. She noticed that Ethan turned his head slightly when someone approached, as if mapping the room by the displacement of air. She noticed that Evan kept one foot bare, feeling the heated wooden floor. The smell of coffee, the faint whistle of the electric kettle, the distant click of the main door's lock, it was all information to them. For Grace, this was a revelation. The twins didn't live in darkness, but in a world of signals the rest of the team ignored. Over the first few minutes, she was instructed on the day's tasks: organizing the pantry, checking the laundry, tidying the library. But it was as she crossed the glass-walled corridor connecting the hall to the kitchen that something caught her attention. The blackout curtain was completely closed, blocking what looked to be a magnificent view of the city at dawn. The reflection in the glass showed a shy strip of light escaping around the edges. Grace took a deep breath, smelling the scent of distant rain from outside, and wondered, almost aloud, what it would be like to live there without ever seeing the sunrise. The routine continued with the precision of a Swiss watch. Ethan reviewed reports through a digital assistant, while Evan revised notes for a new philanthropic campaign. Grace worked in silence, but every sound, every step, every exchange between them was new data on the map she was beginning to draw in her mind. When she placed the coffee tray on the sideboard, she noticed that Ethan knew exactly where the cup was before touching it, as if measuring the space from memory. "Thank you," he said, his voice brief and neutral. But something in his tone indicated he was paying attention to her. Marcus reappeared, calling the brothers for the first market update of the day. The team moved like clockwork, and Grace was left alone for a moment in the kitchen, the heavy silence on her shoulders. She leaned against the sink and looked at the closed curtain, wondering if she should dare to pull it back just a little. But something in the head assistant's tone echoed in her memory. Nothing here moves without authorization. She sighed, returned to her work, and tucked the thought away. for now. However, when she heard the distant sound of the elevator descending, she felt a chill run down her spine. The order was clear, keep everything as it was. But a restlessness was growing. This home was a sanctuary of shadows. Passing through the hall again, she felt the slight breeze coming from the crack in the terrace door. It wasn't just wind, it was a silent invitation, and Grace decided that sooner or later she would answer it. The digital clock in the kitchen read 6:28 a.m. when everything seemed perfectly aligned. The support staff moved with restrained steps, as if every movement had been rehearsed. Ethan was finishing his review of the market indicators, his voice precise as he dictated instructions to his assistant. Adjust the position in the energy sector by 2 percentage points. I don't want exposure above 15%. His authority seemed to fill the space. Evan Chi, still on the sofa, hummed a fragment of jazz, his fingers tapping the rhythm on his thigh. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it created a human counterpoint to the high-tension environment. Grace, meanwhile, dried the last coffee cup, absorbing the atmosphere that surrounded them, the scent of polished leather, the aroma of fresh coffee, and a sense that everything there functioned like a delicate mechanism. It was in that instant that the metallic sound of the elevator cut through the air like a note out of tune. A dry creak, followed by a brief jolt that made the lights flicker for less than a second. Grace's heart sped up. The sound of the electric motor stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence, followed by the sharp ring of an alarm. Ethan stood motionless for half a second, just half a second, but long enough for Grace to notice, before turning in the direction of the sound. "Report now," he ordered, his voice low but with the firmness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The digital assistant replied, "Main elevator out of service. Maintenance team is on the way." Evan let out a short whistle. "Well, I guess perfection decided to take a day off." The alarm continued for a few seconds before being manually silenced by Marcus, who had already reappeared in the hall with an expression of restrained irritation. "No panic. It's just a software issue with the safety brake system," he said, trying to sound calm, but his tone betrayed an uncomfortable urgency. "Check the generator and isolate the elevator until further notice." Grace watched everything from where she stood, fascinated by the way each of them reacted. Ethan standing, impenetrable, Evan laughing lightly, Marcus tense, issuing orders like a general on a battlefield. It was in that moment that she realized this home, seemingly silent and controlled, could also pulse with tension, a tension that didn't just come from the machines. "Are you all right?" she ventured to ask, her voice soft. Evan responded with a smile she could feel even without seeing him. "We're always all right, unless the building collapses. And even then—" He paused dramatically. "It might be interesting to hear the noise." Ethan didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a near smile. "Don't encourage chaos, Evan," he warned. But there was a trace of something different in his voice, something that sounded like adrenaline. Perhaps it was just the discomfort of losing, for a few seconds, absolute control. The metallic noise returned briefly before ceasing for good. A distant click, and the elevator rebooted with a mechanical sigh, returning to its resting position. Marcus sighed, relieved. Problem solved. Full reset. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. Grace noticed that Ethan held his body a bit more rigidly, as if wanting to memorize the sound and the exact time of the failure to anticipate it in the future. Evan, on the other hand, seemed to find the episode amusing. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, turning his face to his brother. "That time we got stuck on the Ferris wheel at Navy Pier." Ethan let out an almost exasperated sigh. "Different. There, we had a view. Here we only have noise." Grace noted that the tension began to dissipate, but the episode left invisible marks on the environment. People moved more quickly, The sound of footsteps on the marble became more pronounced, as if everyone was determined to make up for lost time. She, however, felt that something inside her had changed too. The perfection of this house had cracks, and for the first time, she wondered what else might be hidden beneath the flawless surface. Routine, she thought it was a mask, and masks are made to fall sooner or later. And when the team finally returned to their usual choreography, Grace found herself listening to the distant sound of the wind outside, louder than before, or perhaps just more noticeable. It was as if the entire building had taken a deep breath after the scare. She ran her hand along the side of the counter and felt the slight vibration of the re-established air conditioning. Order was restored, but the memory of the elevator's sudden silence remained, and it was in that silence that she knew there was still something to discover. As she collected the last cups for the pantry, Grace glanced at the corridor with the closed curtains. The morning light must be shining brightly outside now, but in here everything was controlled, even the brightness itself. A thought crossed her mind. If a simple alarm could shake the routine, what would happen if the light came in, even just a little? The next morning, Grace arrived early and found the apartment still immersed in penumbra. The silence was almost sacred, broken only by the sound of a distant vacuum cleaner and the rhythmic click of an assistant's orientation cane. She noted that, despite the luxury of the penthouse, every detail seemed designed to neutralize any unforeseen events. The corridors had continuous flooring, with no rugs that could cause a trip. The tables and shelves were always in the same position, as if they were pieces on a chessboard whose configuration should never be altered. However, what impressed her most were the blackout curtains, heavy, dark, sealing off any possibility of natural light invading the space. It was a home, built to contain the world outside. Marcus appeared in the hall as if he had sensed her curiosity. "Miss Alvarez?" he said, his tone cordial yet without warmth. "Before you proceed, we need to clarify a very simple rule." Grace stopped immediately, straightening her shoulders. "Nothing here is moved without express authorization. We don't change furniture positions. We don't alter the lighting. We don't open curtains. This house is mapped by memory by the Hale brothers. A single centimeter out of place can be an accident waiting to happen." He paused, his eyes narrow. "Understood." Grace nodded quickly. "Understood." But inside, the sentence echoed like a wall erected between the space and life itself. Later, while cleaning the pantry, she heard the twins talking in the living room. Their voices were low but distinct. "Did you notice how the air was different yesterday?" Evan asked in a curious tone. "Smelled of electricity, of ozone," Ethan replied coolly. "I noticed the delay in the meeting. That's what matters." Grace paused for a moment, holding a tablecloth, absorbing their dialogue. It was as if the house were full of small clues to a repressed emotional world that no one dared to touch. Even the smell of the previous night's rain seemed trapped outside the curtains. In the early afternoon, Grace decided to tidy the library, one of the most impressive rooms in the apartment. It was a large space, with oak shelves reaching the ceiling, filled with books on art, economics, and music. The aroma of wood, mixed with the faint scent of leather from the sofas, created a welcoming atmosphere. However, even here, the curtains remained closed. She ran her fingers along the edge of the window, feeling the cold glass. The day was bright, she could tell by the temperature, and for a second she felt an almost uncontrollable urge to pull the curtain just to see how the light would transform the space. But Marcus's voice resonated in her memory, a single centimeter out of place. When she left the library, she found Marcus again in the corridor, reviewing something on his tablet. "Everything in order?" he asked, without looking up. "Yes," Grace replied. He then added, in a tone that sounded like a warning. "The routine here is delicate. It's not about whims. It's about safety." Grace took a deep breath. "I understand. But have you ever thought that something in the routine might be preventing them from living fully?" Marcus finally looked up, a trace of impatience crossing his face. "Our job is to keep their lives predictable. The rest is irrelevant." And he went back to typing, ending the conversation. That evening, Grace stayed later than usual, helping organize the pantry after a private dinner. As she was leaving, she passed through the glass-walled hall and noticed the moon was high. Its silvery light escaped through the cracks in the curtain, drawing a line on the marble floor. She knelt for a moment, touched the strip of light, and felt the residual warmth of the stone. She smiled to herself. This house could try to block out the world, but the world always found a way in. While waiting for the elevator, the memory of the previous day's metallic sound returned. For some reason, that noise had opened something within her, an awareness that absolute control was a fragile illusion. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and saw herself reflected in the brushed steel mirror. "Nothing here moves without authorization," she repeated mentally. But somewhere inside her, a voice responded, "Maybe it's time to move something." The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the living room air the next morning, mingling with the distant sound of Chicago traffic. Grace was discreetly arranging the coffee tray on the center table when she heard Evan start a conversation, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Did you dream about the road last night?" Ethan was sitting in the armchair near the window, his posture rigid. He took a few seconds before answering. "I haven't dreamed about that in years." The tone was cold, but there was a weight to it, as if the memory had cut through his sleep like a silent blade. Grace, who remained silent, felt a chill. It wasn't just a casual question, it was an invitation to open an old wound. Evan got up and went to the kitchen, guiding himself by the sounds he knew by heart. He returned with a mug in hand, sitting on the sofa across from his brother. "It was on Lakeshore Drive," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "It was raining so hard it felt like the lake was falling on the city." Ethan's jaw tightened, his chin tense. "We don't need to talk about this." But Evan didn't stop. "Maybe we do, Ethan. Maybe it's time to stop pretending it was just a logistical setback." The choice of words drew an irritated sigh from his older brother. "Don't you dare turn this into a therapy session." Grace pretended to focus on aligning the cups, but her attention was completely absorbed by the conversation. The air in the room seemed thicker, as if the memory of the accident itself was present. Evan spoke more quietly, his tone now almost a whisper. "I remember the sound of the metal, the shattering glass, the smell of gasoline. I remember your hand pulling me before everything went dark." Ethan finally turned to him, his face contorted in an expression that mixed pain and anger. "And I remember the silence afterward, the doctor saying there was nothing to be done, that we would only see darkness forever." The tension was palpable. Grace felt the urge to leave, but her feet remained planted in the same spot. There was something almost sacred in the exchange, as if she were witnessing a ritual of exorcism. Evan took a deep breath. "Do you remember what you promised that night?" Ethan frowned, impatient. "I promised I would take care of us, and I've kept that promise every day since." Evan nodded, but there was a shadow in his smile. "Caring doesn't mean hiding from the world, Ethan. You close the curtains, literally. Maybe it's time to open them." The silence that followed was so dense that even the sound of the city seemed to fall silent. Ethan stood up and walked to the sideboard, running his hand along the sharp edges of the wood. "You think opening curtains will bring back everything we lost?" His voice was low, almost a growl. Evan responded calmly, "No, But it might bring back something we've forgotten, the feeling of being alive. Grace held her breath, feeling that this was one of those phrases that would echo in the mind long after it was spoken. Marcus entered the room at that moment, interrupting the tension like a blade cutting through the air. "Gentlemen, the car will be ready in 20 minutes. We need to leave for the meeting." Ethan straightened his shoulders, returning to his usual armor. "We'll be ready." But as he turned to Evan, his eyes, or rather, the way he tilted his head, revealed something Grace couldn't define. Maybe it was pain. Maybe it was just the weight of having to face the day with ghosts still alive in his memory. As the brothers prepared to leave, Grace was left alone for a moment in the room, staring at the closed curtain. She could almost feel the imaginary rain beating against the other side of the glass, as if their memory had contaminated the environment. Closing curtains doesn't erase the past, she thought. And at that moment, an idea began to form in her mind. A simple, almost daring idea that could start to change everything. That night, when the penthouse plunged into silence, Grace decided not to leave immediately. She remained in the pantry, collecting the last utensils and listening. Hale Tower seemed to breathe, an almost imperceptible sound of air passing through the gaps in the ventilation system, the gentle hum of the resting elevator, the occasional creak of wood warmed by the heating system. Every noise was a piece of information, a thread she could follow. She walked slowly down the corridor, taking off her shoes to make no noise, and realized the floor had different temperatures. The wood near the windows was slightly cooler than the center of the corridor. She smiled to herself. It was as if the apartment had its own secret geography. The next day, Grace arrived early and used every break in her routine to observe the twins. When Ethan crossed the hall, the sound of his cane tapped the floor with millimeter precision, indicating he knew every step. Evan, on the other hand, seemed more intuitive, leaning his body toward sources of sound, a whistling kettle, the buzz of a phone vibrating on the counter. Grace began to mentally register these details. She noticed that Ethan always paused for a second in front of the living room sideboard before continuing to the library, almost like an invisible reference point. It was like watching a silent dance that only made sense to those who knew the steps. On the terrace, Grace discovered another clue. When she went out to water the plants, the cold Chicago wind hit her face, and she noticed Evan smile as he felt the breeze. He turned in the right direction, facing Lake Michigan, as if he could see it. "The wind's from the east today," he commented casually. Grace replied, "How do you know?" Evan laughed. "The wind changes its smell when it comes from the lake. It has a salty touch, you know." She was surprised. She had never thought of the wind that way. From that day on, she began to notice the city's scent in the morning, when the wind brought the aroma of damp metal and gasoline, and at night, when it carried notes of rain and wet earth. During the afternoon, while organizing the library, Grace began to mentally count the steps between the furniture. From the sofa to the main bookshelf, 10 steps. From the bookshelf to the door, 8 steps. Between the door and the sideboard, 6. She discreetly noted everything on her phone, creating a mental map of the apartment. This wasn't just curiosity, it was an instinct. If the twins lived in a world of sounds, smells, and textures, perhaps she could make that world more accessible, more predictable, without moving anything. An idea began to form, not to alter the space, but to reveal the space to them. That same evening, as she passed through the pantry, Grace accidentally dropped a metal spoon on the floor. The metallic sound echoed down the corridor, and to her surprise, Ethan appeared almost immediately, without calling for anyone. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. Grace nodded, picking up the spoon. "Yes, sorry for the noise." He paused before walking away, and Grace realized he was mentally mapping the location of the sound. When he turned to leave, she had the feeling he had recorded that spot in his brain as an invisible coordinate, and it was there that she was sure she was on the right path. The next day, she began to experiment with small tests. She lit a scented candle in the pantry before breakfast and saw Evan follow the scent to it. She discreetly changed the order of the flowers in the hall, placing the most intensely scented ones near the entrance. Neither of them complained. In fact, Evan seemed more at ease, commenting, "It smells different today, a good different." Ethan, on the other hand, frowned as if trying to identify what had changed, but said nothing. This was a sign. They were perceiving the world more than they admitted, and perhaps they were ready to feel even more. When Marcus passed by the pantry, Grace noticed he cast a suspicious glance at the flowers. "Remember the rules, Grace," he said dryly. She smiled innocently. Of course, nothing has been moved. And it was true. She wasn't changing the space. She was just creating sensory landmarks that didn't break the routine. Marcus seemed satisfied, but Grace knew she would have to be careful. There was a fine line between helping the twins and displeasing Marcus, who saw any change as a threat. That night, on her way home, Grace mentally reviewed all the notes she had made. The map of the apartment was becoming increasingly clear in her mind. The invisible routes were there, just waiting to be illuminated, not with lamps or flashlights, but with sounds, smells, and sensations that could serve as guides. As she lay down, she thought that perhaps the first step to changing the twins' lives wasn't opening a curtain, but opening a path. The private room at the River North restaurant was lit with soft amber light, reflecting off the polished marble and creating an intimate atmosphere. The long oak table was set with millimeter precision, crystal glasses, aligned silverware, napkins folded into perfect triangles. Ethan sat at the head of the table, posture erect, suit impeccable, every movement calculated. Evan, beside him, had a more relaxed expression, his fingers fidgeting as if an invisible song were playing. Grace stood a few steps back, discreetly supervising the service and absorbing every detail of the scene. For her, it was the first time seeing the twins outside the controlled environment of Hale Tower, and the tension was palpable. The investors arrived in groups of 2 or 3, greeting the brothers with rehearsed enthusiasm. There was restrained applause for the company's recent performance, words of admiration for the investment portfolio and the Hale's philanthropic reputation. Ethan responded politely but distantly, as if each word were a signed contract. Evan, on the other hand, broke the ice with humor. "I promise I won't talk about classical music during dinner, unless the food is too good to ignore." The laughter momentarily eased the atmosphere, but soon the conversation returned to numbers, projections, and expectations. It was then that Nora Chen, the journalist invited to cover the event in a humanized way, entered the room. Wearing a simple grey suit and carrying only a notepad, she greeted everyone professionally, but her gaze lingered longer on the twins. When dinner began, Nora asked polite but not obvious questions. "What is it like to lead an empire without seeing what's in front of you? How do you make decisions that change the future for so many people?" The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. Some investors coughed discreetly. Others looked away. Ethan answered first, his voice firm. "With data, Nora, with precision, sight is an overrated metaphor." Evan, however, smiled and leaned forward. "And also with intuition," he added. "Sometimes we make decisions because we feel it's what needs to be done, even without seeing the spreadsheet." Nora jotted down notes quickly, her eyes shining with interest. "So, you don't disagree?" Evan laughed. "Disagreeing is what keeps us alive. If we always agreed, we'd probably be terrible for business." Grace, listening from a distance, realized this was one of the rare times the twins spoke so openly about themselves. And she sensed that Nora would capture something the world didn't yet know about them. In the middle of dinner, one of the investors made an unfortunate joke, asking if the brothers at least knew how to appreciate the city view from the top of the tower. There was an awkward silence. Ethan placed his hands on the table, his knuckles turning white. "The city is more than what you see," he said dryly. "We hear it, we feel it vibrate beneath our feet, and we know more about it than most people who spend their days staring at screens." The tone was so cutting that the investor stammered an apology. Grace saw Nora look up from her notepad and write something down, probably the exact phrase. That would be a headline the next day. When dessert was served, the tension had partially dissipated, but something remained in the air. Evan returned to light conversation, telling funny stories from charity events, making everyone laugh. Ethan, on the other hand, maintained his closed expression, responding only when necessary. Grace realized his control had been shaken, not by the investor's joke, but by Nora's presence itself, which seemed to see beyond the brothers' armored persona. It was as if she had illuminated for a few minutes a dark corner of Ethan's mind. On the way out of the restaurant, Grace was walking behind the twins when she heard Evan whisper, "She's going to write something good." Ethan replied in a grave tone, "Or she'll write something true, which amounts to the same thing, it just hurts more." Grace swallowed hard. For the first time, she understood that part of Ethan's fear wasn't just of the outside world, but of what might be revealed about himself. Back at Hale Tower, the penthouse seemed even quieter than usual. Grace went into the kitchen to turn off the lights and noticed the city lights flickering at the edges of the blackout curtains. The scene from the dinner still echoed in her mind. That night had made it clear that the twins' image was a battlefield, between what the world wanted to see and what they were willing to show. And perhaps, Grace thought, it was in this shadowed space that her idea could flourish. The day began grey, with low clouds covering the Chicago sky, but Grace woke up earlier than usual. She had spent the night thinking about how she could help the twins without breaking Marcus's rules. Upon arriving at the penthouse, she greeted the team and went straight to the terrace, where the cool morning breeze was blowing lightly. She felt the cold air on her face, and an idea bloomed with greater force. She discreetly pulled a small box from her bag, simple metal wind chimes she had bought on her way to work. She held them for a moment, feeling the light weight swing in her hand. It seemed almost childish, but she believed it could be a start. During a break between tasks, when the team was busy in the pantry, Grace went out to the terrace again. The sound of the city was still muffled by the height, but the wind was there, blowing from east to west. She hung the chimes on a hook near the conservatory, in a spot where the breeze would naturally pass. The soft sound of the metal rods chimed like a whisper, delicate, almost spiritual. She stood still for a few seconds, listening to the sound fill the space. The contrast was striking. Inside the apartment, controlled silence. Outside, the wind sang. It was an invitation to something new. Later, Evan was the first to notice. "What's that sound?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "It sounds like music, but it's not coming from inside." Grace smiled. "They're wind chimes, sir. I thought they would suit the terrace." Evan rose from the sofa, guided by his cane, and went to the glass door. He opened it and stood there, letting the wind hit his face. "It's beautiful," he said, almost in a whisper. Ethan, who was further back, approached slowly but stopped before going outside. "Who authorized this?" he asked in a neutral tone, but with a shadow of suspicion. Grace remained calm. "No one. I didn't move anything. I just added a sound where there was once silence." The sound of the chimes continued, marking time irregularly, like a musical compass. Evan took a few steps outside, smiling. "It's as if the wind has found its voice," he said, touching the metal with his fingertips. Ethan remained motionless, but the subtle tilt of his body indicated he was listening intently. "I don't like surprises," he finally said, but his voice was less sharp. "If it becomes a nuisance, it will be removed." Grace nodded respectfully. "If it bothers you, I'll take it down. But I think it will help." And she let the matter drop. For the rest of the day, Grace discreetly observed the twins. She noticed that Evan returned to the terrace more often than usual, always pausing for a few seconds to listen to the sound before continuing on his way. Ethan didn't go out, but he often stood near the glass doors, his head slightly tilted, as if mapping the sound's position by its reverberation. Marcus, for his part, noticed the object and shot Grace a warning look, but said nothing, perhaps because it wasn't really a structural change, just a detail. In the late afternoon, as the wind grew stronger, the chimes rang more intensely, filling the terrace with an almost hypnotic melody. Grace opened the door for a moment to air out the room and let the sound in. Evan smiled. "It's like the house is breathing," he commented. Ethan frowned but didn't move. Grace felt her heart beat faster. This was just the first step, but it was already working. The sound was drawing their attention, giving them a new reference in the space. When everyone had gone to bed, Grace stayed a few more minutes on the terrace, listening to the chimes ring under the dark sky. The city twinkled in the distance, and she felt that this simple sound had the power to change something bigger than she imagined. Tomorrow will be the next step, she thought. She already knew exactly what she would do. The next dawn brought a clear sky, tinted with shades of pink and gold. Grace arrived even before the rest of the team, the cold morning air cutting her skin like tiny needles. This time, she brought a simple tool, the remote for the curtains automation system, programmed to open just 4 centimeters at the first minute of sunlight. Small enough not to alter the routine, large enough to let a line of light cut across the wooden floor like a gleaming blade. When the system activated, she crouched to observe the effect. The light drew a golden line, slowly warming the surface. Grace reached out and felt the growing warmth. She smiled. She hadn't moved anything, only revealed what had always been there. Shortly after 6, Evan was the first to notice. Coming out of the hallway toward the living room, he stopped suddenly. "It's different in here," he said, his voice curious. He took a step forward, tilted his face, and bent down, extending his hand until it touched the floor. "It's warm," he murmured, surprised. Grace, watching from a distance, replied calmly. The curtain opened a little to let the sun in, just enough to warm the floor. Evan smiled, a smile that seemed to come from within. "It's like the day came in to have coffee with us." Ethan appeared soon after, sensing the environment more cautiously. He stopped near the sideboard, his shoulders tense. "Someone changed something," he said, his voice low. Grace approached slowly. "Nothing was moved, Mr. Hale. I just let the sun say good morning." For a moment, the silence stretched on. The distant sound of the wind chimes on the terrace mingled with the soft hum of the ventilation system. Ethan walked slowly until the tip of his cane met the strip of light. He stood there, motionless, feeling the warmth rise through the wood to the soles of his shoes. His fingers tightened on the cane's handle. "Curious," he murmured. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't refusal either. Throughout the morning, Grace noticed small changes in their behavior. Evan passed through the strip of light whenever he could, as if it were a mandatory stop on his route. He sat near the window to feel the warmth on his face, leaning in the right direction when the wind came through a crack. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed disturbed. He moved more rigidly, as if recalibrating his mental map of the space. Grace understood this was part of the process. Discomfort was the first sign of transformation. When Marcus arrived and saw the slightly open curtain, he raised his eyebrows. "Who authorized this?" he asked, his tone cold. Grace kept her voice steady. "I didn't change anything, Mr. Reed. I just programmed it to let in a little natural light, without altering routes or positions." Marcus looked at the twins for a reaction. Evan was the first to speak. "Leave it for today. I like knowing where East is." Ethan remained silent, but didn't order it closed. Marcus sighed, resigned. "Just don't compromise security." And he left, muttering something about protocols. In the afternoon, the sun crossed the sky and the line of light moved slowly, like a natural clock. Grace realized the brothers began to use this movement to orient themselves in time. They knew when it was time for a break, when lunch was approaching. This wasn't just light, it was information, rhythm, life entering the space. Grace watched it all with quiet satisfaction, as if watching a painting come to life before her eyes. At night, when the curtain closed automatically, the room returned to its usual penumbra. Evan let out a sigh. "It's strange, but I already miss the light." Ethan remained silent, sitting in the armchair. Only when everyone had left did he stand up and walk alone to the window. He stood there for long seconds, as if wanting to memorize the residual warmth of the floor. Grace saw the scene from afar and knew something had changed, not just in the house, but within them. The next morning, the light returned through the programmed slit and cut across the room with the same golden line. Grace watched the twins in silence, noticing how Evan almost instinctively approached the strip of light, standing still for a few seconds, as if recharging his energy. But the moment was interrupted by Marcus's dry voice, appearing in the hall like a shadow. "This needs to stop now," he said, pointing to the ajar curtain. "The protocol has been broken 2 days in a row. We cannot compromise the security or predictability of the house." His tone was that of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Grace took a deep breath before responding. "With all due respect, Mr. Reed, nothing has been physically altered. There was no risk. I just gave them an additional sensory reference." Marcus frowned. "They don't need new references. They need stability." Evan, who'd been silent until then, stood up from the sofa and approached. "Marcus, maybe she's right," he said in a calm but firm tone. "I felt more present yesterday, as if time had color." Marcus sighed, visibly irritated. "This isn't about feelings, it's about operational security." Ethan, standing near the sideboard, intervened. "Security is what keeps this routine functioning, Evan." His tone was controlled, but there was a hidden tension. Grace turned to him, risking a bold step. "Mr. Hale, sometimes too much security becomes a prison. The light didn't change anything in the space. It just showed that there's a world out there." For a moment, silence fell over the room. Even the distant sound of the wind chimes seemed to cease. Ethan rested his cane on the floor, thoughtful, his jaw clenched. "1 week," he finally said, his voice low but authoritative. "You have 1 week to prove this doesn't disrupt the routine." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan raised a hand, ending the discussion. "If there's any problem, we go back to the standard immediately." Evan smiled discreetly, as if he had won a small battle. Grace felt her heart race, but kept her face serene. "1 week will be enough," she replied. Inside, however, she was already beginning to formulate a plan to use not just light, but also sound and scent to reinforce the twins' sensory maps. This had become more than a test. It was a real chance for change. That same afternoon, Grace began preparations for what she mentally called the Week of the Senses. She discreetly repositioned small sources of aroma around the house, fresh mint near the pantry, ground coffee in an open jar in the kitchen. At the end of the day, she tested the automation to ensure the curtain would open at the same time every morning. Every detail was designed to be subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. But for those who lived in that space, each stimulus would become a beacon. Evan was excited about the idea and helped calibrate the small experiments. If we can turn the house into a kind of musical score, Ethan will end up liking it, he said, laughing. Grace smiled. Score is a good word. Every sound, every scent, every ray of light will be a note. But deep down, she knew the biggest challenge would be convincing Ethan, who still watched everything with suspicion. He'll need to feel like he's in control, Evan added. Let it seem like it was his decision. At night, when the penthouse fell silent, Grace walked through the dark corridors and felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Each step echoed like a reminder that this week could change not only the dynamic of the house, but also the lives of the twins. As she neared the curtain, she stopped and touched the heavy fabric, imagining what it would be like when the sun came in again in the morning. She took a deep breath, like someone preparing for a concert. Tomorrow would be the first day of the week of the senses. On the first morning of the week, the apartment was awakened by an invisible orchestra. The soft sound of the wind chimes echoed from the terrace. At the same time, the curtain opened its traditional 4-centimeter slit, flooding the floor with the line of golden light. The aroma of fresh coffee spread through the pantry even before the staff served breakfast. Grace watched from a distance as Evan entered the room, taking a deep breath. "It's different today," he commented with a smile. He walked to the strip of light, stopped directly on it, and raised his face to feel the warmth. Ethan appeared seconds later, his steps cautious. He stood motionless before the light, his jaw tense. "It's just light," he said, as if to himself, before heading to the table. On the second day, Grace introduced a new stimulus. Soft music coming from a fixed point in the corridor, almost imperceptible. A piano piece, repeating the same melodic motif hypnotically. Evan followed the sound as if being guided, laughing as he neared the source. "It's like following a soundtrack," he said. Ethan, however, stopped midway, trying to locate where it was coming from. "It's louder on the left side," he murmured, adjusting the position of his head. It was the first time Grace had seen him deliberately explore something. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, he took a deep breath and just said, "It works." On the third day, Grace spread small pots of aromatic herbs in strategic places, mint near the entrance, rosemary in the library, lavender in the hall. The entire apartment seemed to have gained layers of personality. Evan, smelling the mint, commented, "It smells like childhood. Our grandmother used to grow this in the garden of the lake house." Ethan approached, touched the pot with his fingers, and remained silent for a few seconds. Then he turned to Grace. "Just don't overdo it, 1 scent at a time." She nodded, hiding a smile. It sounded more like a request than an order. On the fourth day, something unexpected happened. During the afternoon, a delivery person left the door open for a few seconds, and the wind blew in, rustling the curtains. The line of light moved unpredictably, and for a moment, Evans stumbled and nearly knocked over a vase. Ethan was quick. He took 2 steps forward and caught the vase before it fell. The gesture was instinctive, fast, almost heroic. "Did you see that?" Evan asked, laughing. "No," Ethan replied. "I felt it." It was the first time a genuine smile had crossed his lips since the experiment began. On the 5th day, Grace decided to introduce music at night. She chose a cello recording, deep and velvety, positioned near the terrace. The wind chimes played in the background, creating a natural duet. Evan lay on the sofa, listening in silence, and commented, "It's as if the apartment has gained a soul." Ethan remained standing, but his posture was less rigid. "It's less empty," he admitted, before sitting down. It was a moment of rare tranquility, as if the two brothers were experiencing something together, in sync. On the sixth day, Grace observed the twins beginning to move through the penthouse without calling for assistance. Small stretches, short steps, but without hesitation. Evan crossed the living room alone and found the piano, running his hand over the keys like someone greeting an old friend. Ethan, more restrained, walked down the corridor to the library, mentally counting his steps. 15 to the door, he said in a low voice. Grace almost clapped but restrained herself. This was what she had hoped for, growing autonomy, confidence beginning to blossom. On the last day of the week, Grace prepared a special coffee and left the curtain open a few minutes longer, allowing the light to spread across the room like a golden carpet. Evan sat on the floor, eyes closed, absorbing the sensation. Ethan stood beside him, motionless, but did not order the curtain to be closed. Marcus entered the room, ready to give his final verdict, but hesitated when he saw the two brothers serene, almost at peace. "Well," he finally said, "no accidents, no confusion. I think we could continue, under observation." Grace breathed a sigh of relief. The week of the senses had been a success. That night, as she put away the utensils, Grace looked at the apartment and felt that something had truly changed. The space seemed less like a fortress and more like a living home. It wasn't just about chimes, light, or music. It was about giving the twins back a sense of presence that had seemed lost since the accident, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Dr. Lila Pembroke's office was in a modern building in the heart of Chicago, with glass windows that allowed soft, natural light to enter. Grace, Evan, and Ethan arrived accompanied by Marcus, who seemed as tense as ever. The environment had the scent of light wood mixed with the faint antiseptic smell characteristic of well-kept clinics. In the reception area, an aquarium with colorful fish emitted a relaxing sound of running water, creating a calm atmosphere. Evan tilted his face toward the sound, smiling. "I like places that don't sound like hospitals." Ethan remained with his arms crossed, his expression closed. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered. When they entered the office, they were greeted by Lila, a woman with a serene demeanor and a firm voice. "Mr. and Mr. Hale," she greeted, shaking their hands. "Thank you for coming." Ethan responded formally. "We're here to close a chapter, not open a new one." Lila was not intimidated. "Perhaps we'll do both," she replied with a slight smile. Grace watched closely. There was something in the way Lila spoke that conveyed authority without being invasive. She seemed like someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The first step was simple: light perception tests. The room was darkened, and a sequence of flashes was projected at different points. Evan was the first to react. "I think I saw something," he said hesitantly. "Not a shape, just a change in shadow." Lila made quick notes. "Excellent. That's already a good sign." When it was Ethan's turn, he remained motionless during the first stimuli until he finally frowned. "There's a difference between dark and less dark," he admitted, as if confessing a secret. Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. It was the first time he had acknowledged any possibility of perception. Next came the contrast and movement tests. Lila used a narrow blade of light, moving it slowly from side to side. Evan followed it with his head, as if listening to music. "I can tell when it moves," he said, excited. Ethan took a deep breath, reluctant, but ended up admitting he felt a change in intensity. "That doesn't mean we can see," he said quickly, almost defensively. "No," Lila replied calmly, "but it means we have a starting point." Marcus intervened, trying to bring the tone back to pragmatism. "What does this mean in practical terms?" Lila crossed her hands over her clipboard. "It means you still have residual perception that can be stimulated. With a protocol of light therapy and sensory training, we can enhance these responses. It's not a miracle, it's science. Evan smiled. I like science. Ethan remained silent, but Grace noticed his posture had changed. His arms were no longer crossed, and he seemed to be seriously considering what he had just heard. At the end of the consultation, Lila provided a detailed plan: weekly sessions, use of light stimulation glasses, and daily exercises to train the brain to recognize patterns. The process is gradual, she explained, but every small response is a victory. Grace saw Evan nod with enthusiasm, while Ethan just said, "We'll see," but there was a trace of curiosity in his voice that hadn't been there before. In the car on the way home, Evan commented, "This gives me hope." Ethan let out a sigh. Hope is dangerous. Grace, who was in the front seat, turned and said, "Hope is also fuel." For a moment, silence filled the car. Then Evan laughed. "We always need fuel, brother." Ethan didn't answer, but a slight nod revealed he was processing every word. Marcus called the meeting for late afternoon, when the light was already beginning to fade from the programmed slit in the curtain. The penthouse meeting room, with its oak table and leather-upholstered chairs, looked like a stage set for a verdict. "We need to talk about exposure," he began, sliding a PDF report to the tablet, which read it aloud to those present. "Rumors have been circulating since the dinner with investors. If we proceed with Dr. Pembroke's protocol, it will become impossible to keep this out of the press. Expectations will be created, and expectations are public debts." Evan propped his elbows on the table, attentive. Ethan crossed his arms, silent. His face turned toward the sliver of light, as if listening to an invisible speaker. "We're not selling a miracle," Evan said with calm firmness. "We're talking about science, a gradual protocol, measurable data," Marcus replied in the same tone, but colder. "Nuance doesn't survive headlines. Today you give glimpses of light, tomorrow they demand a total cure. And when it doesn't come, they'll tank the reputational value of the company, the foundation of you both." Grace watched from the side, without a chair, as if preferring the margin to the podium. She thought of the sound of the chimes on the terrace, the warmth of the wood under the sun, the way small changes had already altered the twins. Daily life. "What if the narrative is controlled by us?" she ventured. Marcus shot her a sharp look. "Controlling the narrative is an expensive illusion." Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, polished. "When we lost our sight, I gained two certainties. I control what I can, and I hide what I can't. That kept the company alive, the foundation relevant, our routine breathing." The word hung in the air, uncomfortable. Evan leaned forward. "Maybe it's time to trade hiding for choosing." The silence that followed was not empty. It had the texture of a closed room, the smell of leather and cold coffee, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Marcus filled the void with tactics. "If you insist, I propose conditions: zero press initially, confidentiality with the medical team, and sessions conducted out of the city, with no visible movements at the tower." "The lake house," Grace said, before Prudence could stop her. "Less noise, more sky, a wind that sings. The protocol would work better there." Evan smiled, recognizing the image of the wind as an old ally. Marcus made a note: pragmatic. Ethan didn't react immediately. The slight tilt of his head indicated he was processing variables, risks, escape routes. No cameras, no footnotes in magazine profiles. "If it fails far away," he concluded. "And if it works," Evan retorted, a new glint in his voice. "If it works, we decide when to open the curtains," Ethan finished, and the metaphor landed like a formal decision. Grace asked to speak, which was unusual. "I know I'm not in PR, but I understand cartography. What we're doing is mapping light, wind, scent, time. You've already started walking short stretches on your own. The protocol just expands the drawing. Marcus took a deep, weary breath. The right map in the wrong hands becomes a trap. Nora Chen crossed everyone's mind without being mentioned. The reporter was out there, orbiting. And if one day the story is told, Evan said, let it be the right story. Not some fake miracle, but the quiet, steady work of relearning how to perceive the world. Ethan drummed his fingers on the tabletop, 3 rhythmic taps, as if checking his own pulse. The discussion returned to the terrain of details, timeline, logistics, confidentiality, legal coverage. Marcus distributed tasks like someone assembling a mechanism. He would handle contracts and NDAs. Grace would coordinate the lake house and the sensory environment. Lila would define the protocol and send equipment. And me? Evan asked, half joking, half serious. You play, Ethan said, surprising his brother. Turn time into sound, so we know if we're moving forward or just distracting ourselves. The tension loosened for a moment. A tacit smile circulated, like a light wind passing through high fences. When the meeting ended, the light had already receded from the strip on the floor, leaving only residual warmth. Ethan remained in the room, his body turned toward the closed window. Grace approached in silence, not breaking the distance. I'm afraid of hope, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper with no audience. Me too, Grace said with disarming honesty. But fear is just the old map, telling you it doesn't know the new path. For a moment, the sound of the chimes on the terrace seemed to reach the room, faint, improbable. Ethan nodded so slightly it could have been a tremor. Prepare the house. Marcus turned off the screens, locked virtual files, secured schedules. Evan, in the hallway, strummed a short sequence on his portable keyboard, 4 notes reminiscent of early morning in a big city. The lake house, then, he said, to no one and to everyone. Chicago breathed outside. Cars, sirens, the metallic breath of the metropolis. Inside, the house held on to the last warmth of the day, and the decision finally took shape, to leave, in calculated silence, for a place where the wind could speak louder than the headlines. The lake house looked like something out of an autumn postcard. Light wood, large windows facing Lake Michigan, and a deck that extended almost to the water's edge. Grace arrived a day early to prepare everything. She installed wind chimes at 3 different heights, low-pitched near the ground, medium-pitched on the porch columns, and high-pitched on the roof beams. Walking barefoot through the house, she marked a few strategic spots on the wooden floor with tactile tape, by the front door, on the path to the kitchen, and near the stairs leading to the mezzanine. Like an invisible musical score, she murmured to herself, testing each sonic and thermal cue. When she finished, she stood on the deck for a few minutes, feeling the wind carry the scent of cold water and damp leaves. The environment felt ready to tell a new story. When the twins arrived the next morning, the air was still heavy with fog. Evan was the first to get out of the car, inhaling deeply. It smells like childhood, he said, a smile forming on his face. It smells like freedom, Grace corrected softly. Ethan remained at the door for a few seconds before entering. The sound of the low-pitched chimes was the first thing he noticed. This is new, he commented, his voice low. Yes, Grace replied. They mark the wind's direction and the sun's position. You can tell where east is by the sound, Evan laughed. Great, now I can say, I hear the dawn. Inside the house, the silence was broken only by the creaking of the wood and the sound of the waves outside. Lila joined the first session via video call, her voice broadcast through the speakerphone. Let's start slow, she said, instructing Grace to place the light stimulation glasses on Evan first. He sat on the sofa, his fingers nervously intertwined, and took a deep breath. When the light sequence began, his lips parted slightly, I feel pulsations, he said, surprised. It's not seeing, it's perceiving. Ethan watched from his feet, arms crossed, but something in his expression betrayed his intrigue. Then it was Ethan's turn. He resisted for a few seconds, almost taking off the glasses. "I'm not here to feel anything," he said, irritated. "Yes, you are," Grace replied firmly, "or you wouldn't have come." Ethan closed his mouth and remained still. Midway through the session, his fingers tightened on the arm of the chair. "It's brighter," he muttered, "but I don't know if it's in my head." Lila smiled from the other side of the screen. "It's in your brain, which is much better than in your head." A light tension ran through the room, part laughter, part relief. During the breaks, Grace led the twins to explore the porch, using the chimes as guides. Evan followed the sounds almost as if dancing, his bare feet feeling the texture of the cold wood. Ethan was more restrained, but walked to the edge where the wind was strongest and stood listening. "It seems bigger out here," he said. "It is bigger," Grace replied. "The wind tells more stories than walls." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Just the sound of the lake filling the space. It was as if that moment was recording a new memory in their bodies. On the second day, Grace introduced discreet scents into the house. Cinnamon in the kitchen, jasmine in the hallway, fresh coffee at dawn. The combination created an invisible trail that the twins began to follow almost intuitively. Evan commented, "It's like each room has gained a personality." Ethan didn't comment, but was seen more than once stopping in front of one of the open windows, turning his face to feel the wind and light. For Grace, it was a sign that the barriers were beginning to crumble. At night, Evan sat at the piano on the mezzanine and began to play a soft melody. The music mixed with the sound of the chimes and the rustling of the leaves outside. Ethan quietly went up and leaned on the railing, listening. "This piece is new," he commented. "Yes," Evan said, without stopping. "I call it 4 centimeters. Ethan frowned but said nothing. When he came back down, Grace noticed he touched the tactile marker near the stairs with his feet, as if mentally recording a route. On the third day, Evan's response to the stimuli was even more intense. He reported perceiving sharper variations in brightness, almost as if there were flashes behind his eyelids. Ethan remained more skeptical but spent more time with the glasses on, though without openly admitting it. "I don't want hope," he said to Grace in a rare private moment. "It's not hope, it's training," she replied. "Hope is waiting. This is acting." He didn't answer, but at dinner he sat closer to the window, letting the wind touch his face without complaint. On the morning of the 4th day at the lake house, Marcus arrived with his face more closed off than usual, his phone still in hand. "It's out," he said without preamble, tossing the device on the table. On the screen, a local tabloid headline blared, "Reclusive billionaires test miracle cure in secret hideaway." There was a blurry photo of the lake house facade and an anonymous quote from a close source describing the experimental protocol. Evan paled, bringing a hand to his forehead. Ethan picked up the phone and held it for a few seconds, as if measuring the weight of the news. "Who leaked it?" he asked, his voice too low to hide his anger. Marcus didn't answer immediately. "We're still investigating, but the story is already spreading." The atmosphere in the house changed instantly. The light coming through the windows seemed colder, the sound of the wind chimes sharper, as if the wind had become an intruder. "This was exactly what I feared," Ethan said, turning to Evan. "Did you have to tell everyone we were trying something? Now we're a spectacle." Evan stood up abruptly. "I didn't tell anyone, and even if I had, why would it be a problem for the world to know we still believe in something?" His voice rose half a tone, a rare occurrence. Grace stood motionless by the stairs, her heart racing. It was the first time she had seen the two brothers truly confront each other. Ethan took a step forward, his cane hitting the floor hard. "Because believing is weakness. Because hope makes headlines, and headlines make stocks fall. I spent 17 years making sure no one saw our cracks. And you, in 1 week, open the windows and let everyone look inside. Evan replied in the same tone. Maybe it's time to stop living behind curtains, Ethan. The world already knows we're blind. Maybe it needs to know we're still human. The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. Marcus tried to intervene. Gentlemen, we need a containment strategy, not a domestic dispute. But Ethan didn't hear him. He turned to Grace, his eyes unseen but his voice cutting. This started with you. With chimes, with light, with sense. You thought you were helping, but you just exposed what shouldn't have been exposed. Grace felt her face burn. I didn't leak anything, she said firmly. And if someone exposed something, it was because they saw life happening in here. That's not a scandal, it's news. For a moment, the silence was so absolute that only the sound of the lake lapping against the shore filled the space. Evan took a step toward his brother, lowering his tone, but with a firmness that hurt more than a shout. You don't have to fight me, Ethan. I'm on your side. I always have been. Ethan took a deep breath, his anger shifting to exhaustion. Then stop pushing me into the light. Maybe I don't want to see. The sentence was a blow. Evan recoiled, as if he had been punched in the stomach. He turned his face and went up to the mezzanine, the sound of his footsteps echoing up the stairs. The sound of the chimes outside seemed to accompany him, a metallic lament. Marcus picked up the phone from the table. We have reporters on the road heading here. We need to secure the perimeter and issue a statement. Ethan nodded, his voice now controlled again. Nothing will be said. No pictures, no statement. Grace approached slowly. And when they ask what you're doing here, Ethan answered without looking at her, we'll say we're resting, nothing more. It was a surrender to silence, but also a barrier being erected anew. That night, the house seemed suspended in the air. Evan remained on the mezzanine for hours, playing a slow, melancholic melody on the piano. Grace stayed in the kitchen, preparing tea that no one drank. Ethan stood on the deck, listening to the wind alone, his cane propped against the wall. When he finally came inside, he passed Grace without a word. The sound of his bedroom door closing was the only noise to break the heavy silence. But somehow, Grace felt that argument had planted a seed, painful but necessary. The day was clear and cold, and the sunset promised to be a spectacle. Grace arranged the main room of the lake house for the therapy session. The curtains opened to the exact degree, the wind chimes ringing at irregular intervals, the sound of the lake waves creating a natural soundscape. Lila monitored everything via video call, her serene voice guiding the brothers. Today we're going to try something new, she explained. Evan, you'll be first. Evan took a deep breath and sat on the sofa. Grace placed the stimulation glasses on his face, adjusting the straps delicately. Are you ready? She asked. Ready, he replied, though his voice betrayed his tension. Ethan remained standing, arms crossed, observing every detail like a general overseeing an operation. The light sequence began. First, soft flashes, then more intense ones, in a controlled pattern. Evan frowned, as if something had crossed his mind. Wait, he said, tilting his face. There's something different. Grace froze, her eyes fixed on him. Describe it, Lila requested through the speakerphone. Evan took a deep breath. It's not an image. It's like a bright line. Right here. He pointed to the left, toward the window where the sun was beginning to set, as if the darkness is less dark. Grace felt a lump in her throat. Lila smiled on the other end of the call. That's luminosity perception. Continue. Evan began to laugh, nervously, almost in disbelief. I can feel when the light gets brighter. He took off the glasses for a moment and turned his face to the window, even without seeing shapes. "I know where the sun is. I feel it." His voice broke on the last word, and he covered his face with his hands. Grace felt her eyes well up with tears, but maintained her composure. "You just mapped the sunset," she said softly. The sound of the wind chimes seemed to accompany the moment, as if nature itself were celebrating. Ethan took a step forward, his face impassive, but his body tense. "That's just a reflex," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It could be gone tomorrow." Evan removed his hands from his face and stood up. "Or it could come back tomorrow. Or it could get stronger." There was a new light in his voice, something that resembled hope, something Ethan feared. "Don't turn this into a banner, Evan," he warned. "It's not an achievement, it's an anomaly." The silence that followed was cut only by the distant sound of the lake. Suddenly, Ethan turned to Grace, anger replacing his neutrality. "You're the one who planted this in him, this expectation." Grace held his gaze firmly. "I didn't plant anything. I just made space for something to grow." Evan intervened, this time more firmly. "She didn't give me hope, Ethan. I found it myself, and that's mine." The tension between the two brothers was almost palpable, as if the room had become too small to hold them both at the same time. Ethan dropped his cane on the table with force, the sound reverberating through the room. "I don't want to live waiting for the world to change just because I felt something different for a second," he shouted. Evan didn't back down. "Then live without feeling anything if you want. But don't drag me into your darkness." The sentence landed like a blow. Grace fought the urge to intervene. She knew this confrontation was necessary. It was the first time Evan had stood up to his brother so openly, and the first time Ethan seemed on the verge of yielding. Minutes later, Ethan picked up his cane and went out onto the deck alone. The wind was strong, cold, carrying the scent of water and leaves. He stood there, facing the lake, his breathing rapid. Grace watched him from a distance, not approaching. It wasn't pure anger, it was fear. Fear that this small thread of light would pull apart everything he had built to protect himself over the past years. When he came back inside, he only said, "I want to try tomorrow." Evan smiled in silence, and Grace realized a new phase was beginning there, not just for the twins, but for everyone in the house. The next morning, the atmosphere at the lake house was charged with expectation. The wind blew hard, the metal chimes tinkled in different tones, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was almost hypnotic. Ethan came down the stairs slowly, his cane tapping the wooden floor in rhythmic intervals. He stopped in the living room, where Grace and Evan were already waiting for him. "I want to try again," he said, without preamble. The sentence landed like a deep note in the air. Evan gave a restrained smile, but said nothing. He feared any enthusiasm might push his brother away from what seemed like a fragile decision. Grace just nodded, respecting the silent space Ethan seemed to need. "But there will be rules," he continued, his voice firm. "No press, no photos, no footnotes in Sunday papers. If anyone leaks anything again, everything ends at that very moment." Marcus, who was observing the scene from behind them, nodded in approval. "I've already taken care of it," he said, handing Ethan a tablet with the renewed confidentiality agreements. Ethan didn't touch the device. "I don't need to read it to know you've secured everything. I just need to trust that you'll follow through." Marcus nodded again, more seriously this time. "I will." Lila was on the screen, connected via video call, and heard every word. "Ethan," she said, her voice patient, "your skepticism is valid, but every session you complete increases the chance of a neurological response. Are you willing to commit for more than one day?" Ethan was silent for a moment, the sound of the wind from outside filling the pause. "1 week," he finally replied. "After that, I'll decide if I continue." Lila smiled slightly. 1 week is enough for us to know if we're on the right path." When the session began, the atmosphere felt different from all the other times. Ethan sat with a rigid posture, as if he were about to face an interrogation. Grace placed the stimulation glasses on him and stood by his side, one hand lightly resting on the arm of the chair. The light pulsed in longer sequences this time, creating a gentle pattern. Gradually, Ethan's body relaxed, his jaw less clenched. "There's a faint glow," he murmured. "More to the left side." Lila made a note. "Excellent. Keep describing." Evan, sitting further back, smiled discreetly. Every word from his brother was a small victory. At the end of the session, Ethan remained seated for a few seconds, breathing deeply. "It's not hope," he said, almost to himself. "It's just data, and I can accept data." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Data is just the beginning. What you feel matters too." Ethan didn't answer, but the way he stood up indicated that something in him was lighter. Before leaving the room, he turned to Grace. "Continue with the light in the morning, but keep everything as it is. No new experiments without telling me." "Deal," she said with a faint smile. That afternoon, Evan suggested a walk to the end of the deck. Ethan hesitated but followed his brother. The wind was stronger, swaying the chimes in a disordered chorus. Evan held out his hand, letting Ethan follow him just by the sound of the metal rods. When they reached the end, they stood side by side. "You're afraid of being disappointed," Evan said, looking out at the lake. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm afraid of changing everything only to find I'm still in the same place." Evan placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Maybe it's not about arriving at a new place. Maybe it's about walking differently." At night, Grace prepared tea and brought it to the porch, where the two brothers were sitting in silence. The sound of the water and the cold air created a kind of reverence. "Tomorrow we can adjust the intensity," she said in a neutral tone. Ethan nodded. "Do it." And he went back to staring into the darkness outside, as if measuring the length of the path he would have to travel in the coming days. The afternoon warmth was suddenly replaced by a cold wind that swept across the porch of the lake house. Dark clouds advanced rapidly across the sky, dyeing the lake a metallic grey. Grace noticed the unusual silence of the birds and smelled ozone in the air, a sign of a storm. "It's going to pour," she said, closing the terrace door, but before she could secure the windows, thunder rumbled so close it made the walls vibrate. The wind chimes went wild, a dissonant metallic choir. "Power system unstable," announced the house's electronic voice, seconds before everything went dark. The apartment plunged into total blackness. Marcus ran to check the generator, but a short circuit triggered the alarm. "We need to restart it manually," he shouted, his voice almost swallowed by the sound of the rain now lashing against the windows. Grace looked at the twins. Evan was standing, his face lifted to the sound of the water, almost smiling. Ethan, on the other hand, was motionless, his breathing rapid. The absence of the small cues, the strip of light, the hum of the air conditioner seemed to dismantle the mental map he had built. "I know where the generator is," Grace said, "but I need help getting there fast." Evan was the first to move. "Let's go." But before he could take the first step, Ethan grabbed his cane and positioned himself in front. "I'll go." Grace hesitated. "Are you sure?" His look, or rather the way he tilted his head, was one of pure determination. "This is my map. If I can't use it now, it was all for nothing." The sound of the wind howling outside seemed like a cruel encouragement. Grace nodded and guided him to the beginning of the corridor. "Listen to the chimes," she said, her voice calm. "The low one is east, the high one is west. The generator is toward the lower sound." Every step was a battle against panic. The cold floor under his shoes, the echo of the thunder, the smell of wet wood coming from the cracks in the doors. It was all information Ethan processed as if it were code. Evan followed close behind, ready to intervene if necessary, but he didn't. "Left now," Ethan said, surprising everyone. He had recognized the sound of the medium chime, the one marking the corridor near the service door. Grace cleared the way, and they reached the generator room. Marcus was already there, struggling to manually restart the system. "Almost there," he said, turning the ignition key. The engine roared to life, and the lights slowly returned, flickering like fireflies. When everything stabilized, Ethan stood in the middle of the room, panting. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was something else. He could feel his heart pounding, his cane firm in his hand. "I did it," he murmured. Evan smiled, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "You navigated the dark, Ethan." Grace took a deep breath, a mix of relief and pride. "The map worked," she said. Ethan nodded, and for a moment he seemed taller, more solid. The storm still raged outside, but something inside the house had changed forever. Back in the main room, everyone sat in silence, listening to the rain gradually subside. The smell of wet earth and the rhythmic sound of drops on the deck created a strange sense of peace after the chaos. Evan sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, and started to laugh softly, as if releasing the tension. Ethan allowed himself a half smile. "Don't laugh," he said, but without anger. "You would have gotten lost if you went alone." Evan replied, "Maybe, but you didn't get lost, and that's what matters." That night, Grace prepared a hot soup for everyone. Ethan ate in silence, but his posture was different, less rigid, less defensive. Before going up to his room, he stopped in the hall and turned his face to the window. The curtain was still open, letting in the distant glow of lightning. "Leave it," he said to Grace. "I want to wake up with the day." It was the first time he had asked for something that deliberately exposed him to the light. Grace smiled. "It will be a good day," she replied, and she knew it was true. Dawn arrived silently, as if the world had decided not to interrupt what was about to happen. The storm had washed the sky clean, leaving it an almost metallic blue, and the lake reflected the nascent light like a liquid blade. Grace woke before everyone else and went to the living room, checking if the curtain automation would work as it had the day before. At 6 o'clock sharp, the strip of light opened on the floor, drawing a golden line that cut through the silence. The warmth began to spread slowly, warming the wood as if an invisible hand were touching the house. Grace stood motionless, as if awaiting something sacred. Ethan came down the stairs alone, without calling for anyone. His cane tapped the floor in an almost meditative, rhythmic way, as if each step were a beat. Upon reaching the living room, he stopped. The sound of the chimes outside was softer that morning, as if the wind also knew something special was about to happen. Ethan slowly approached the strip of light and stood right at its edge, his body rigid, his head slightly tilted. Grace watched from a distance, not daring to interrupt. "It's different today," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Evan appeared right behind him, still sleepy, and stopped upon seeing his brother motionless. "Different how?" he asked cautiously. Ethan took another step forward, entering the illuminated strip completely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, he inhaled sharply. "I feel something." The words came out almost soundlessly. Grace took a step forward, her heart racing. "Describe it," she asked. Ethan turned his face toward the sun, his eyelids moving as if reacting by reflex. "It's brighter. Here," he said, pointing to his own chest. "Not with my eyes. Here." Evan smiled, a smile that turned into a nervous laugh. "You're feeling the light," he said, as if confirming a miracle. Ethan brought a hand to his face, his fingers pressing against his temples. "I don't know if I like it." Grace approached, her voice firm and delicate at the same time. "You don't have to like it, you just have to let it happen." He took a deep breath and remained there, motionless, as if engraving that moment into his body. The sound of the lake, the wind, the warmth of the floor, all seemed to conspire to turn that moment into a rite of passage. Suddenly, Ethan laughed, a short, almost incredulous laugh, and then let the tears come. It wasn't a loud cry, but a silent, deep one, the kind of cry that dissolves years of resistance. Evan came closer and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Welcome back," he said simply. Ethan didn't answer, but he turned his face slightly toward the touch, accepting it. Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, but maintained her posture. She knew she was witnessing something that would change the course of that family forever. When he finally stepped away from the strip of light, Ethan seemed different, lighter, less shielded. "I don't want anyone to know about this yet," he said, recovering some of his rigidity. "This isn't a story for tabloids." Evan agreed seriously. "It will be our story until we're ready to tell it." Marcus, who had arrived in the middle of the scene and watched in silence, just nodded. "When you decide to speak, we'll make sure it's done the right way." There was no longer a tone of imposition in his voice, only respect. That night, the house seemed to breathe with them. Evan played a new, gentle melody on the piano, which he called First Dawn. Ethan sat on the sofa listening, his face turned toward the open window. Grace brought tea for the three of them and stood leaning against the door, just watching. It was as if that moment were too fragile to be broken by words. The chimes on the terrace rang softly, rocked by the night wind. For the first time, the lake house felt completely alive. Lila arrived at the lake house in person at dawn, carrying a black briefcase with lightweight equipment and a blue-covered notebook. The air still smelled of damp wood from the storm, and the wind chimes rang in a restrained rhythm, as if respecting the house. "Today I want to measure, not convince," she said, greeting everyone. She set up a portable panel, adjusted a controlled spectrum lamp, and placed discrete sensors on each brother's fingers to record galvanic response. At 6 o'clock sharp, the 4-centimeter slit opened. Lila's lamp turned on at low intensity, and the room gained a shy glow that didn't wound the darkness, but merely thinned it. They started with Evan. Tests of alternating luminosity detection, then contrast in different quadrants of the visual field, always with instructions in a low voice. "Reaction 180 milliseconds faster than last week," Lila noted, her pencil scratching the paper with precision. Evan smiled, his shoulders relaxed, and commented, "I can feel when the light moves, not just when it turns on." When it was Ethan's turn, the tension in the room rose a degree. He sat down, his cane leaning against the arm of the chair, and took a deep breath, a soft flash on the left, pause, a flash on the right. "Left! Now right," he said, almost irritated to admit it. Lila looked up, satisfied. "Latency, 230 milliseconds. Consistent. It's not a coincidence." The metrics continued: perception threshold, directionality, fatigue. At the end, Lila placed the notebook on the table. "These aren't miracles, they're curves," she declared, pointing to the graph, "and they're rising for both of you." The silence that followed had the texture of cotton, warm, protective. Evan was the first to speak. "Thank you for treating hope like data." Ethan nodded dryly, but the rigidity in his jaw had eased a bit. "If it's data, I'll stay," he said. "At least until the curve tells me to stop." After the tests came what no one had planned, a conversation without equipment. On the porch, with the smell of fresh coffee and the lake wind bringing cool notes, Ethan stared into nothingness with the honesty of someone who is tired. "I never wanted to drag you into my darkness," he said to Evan, his voice low. "It was me who was afraid you'd pull me to a place I wouldn't know how to live in." Evan gave a self-conscious laugh, his eyes moist. "Maybe there's no right place. Maybe there's just the way to get there." They stood side by side, no grand embraces, just the sound of the chimes filling the interval between sentences. Grace observed the scene from a respectful distance, like someone who recognizes that certain bridges are only built in silence. Marcus appeared at the door with his phone in hand, but didn't interrupt. He waited for the moment to dissolve its own hardness, and, only then, spoke. "I have contacts pressing me for a version. I can keep saying no comment, or you can choose how to tell it." He took a breath, as if swallowing a letterhead. "If you decide to talk, it will be on your terms." The sentence fell freely, without shackles. Grace realized it was more than a concession. It was a belated respect for what spreadsheets don't capture. Nora was called for a discreet meeting that same afternoon. No cameras, no photographers, just a small recorder and a notepad. "Off the record until you give the green light," she assured them. The room had its windows open, the natural light cutting across the floor at an angle. "I want to hear what doesn't fit in a press release," she said. Evan recounted the week of the senses, as if narrating a song. Chimes, scents, maps. He spoke of the first shimmer, as if describing a private sunrise. Ethan chose his words like someone handling glass. "I didn't see. I perceived. Between dark and less dark, there is a territory." Nora didn't interrupt. She let humanity do the work that no headline could. At the end, Nora closed her notebook and placed the recorder on top of it. "If I write it, it will be about the process, not the miracle. About the work, not about blind faith." Marcus, on the side, didn't correct, didn't ask for quotes, didn't negotiate adjectives. He just said, "No publishing until we align on the format." Nora nodded. "I'm not in a hurry. You're relearning time. I can learn too." Grace felt a relief that didn't seem her own. It was collective, like a house that, at last, breathes. That evening, Lila sent a technical summary with 3 sentences that would fit in any report, and yet seemed like poetry. Residual, luminous perception, increasing directionality, measurable consistency. Evan played a new sketch on the mezzanine piano, mixing repetition and variation, like a data line rising in a sawtooth pattern. Ethan, sitting near the window, didn't ask to close the curtain. 4 centimeters, he said, almost a toast. Grace laughed lightly. Sometimes 4 are enough to change a whole life. The day of the announcement arrived on a clear morning, with the lake still reflecting the cold blue of early spring. The communications team had prepared something simple, a room lit only by natural light, no excessive cameras, no audience. Nora was present with her discreet recorder, and 2 trusted journalists were invited to record the statement without distortion. Marcus, ever meticulous, reviewed every logistical detail, but this time without imposing emotional barriers. "You set the tone," he said, handing the space over to the twins as one might return a key. Evan was the first to speak, seated near the strip of light projected on the floor. "We didn't come here to talk about a cure," he began, his voice clear. "We came to talk about presence, about how it's possible to map a world even without seeing it, how wind, sound, and warmth can be compasses." He spoke with serenity, without drama, and the room seemed to lean in to hear every word. "We don't promise that everyone will see light as we have, but we promise that it's worth searching for your own way of perceiving the day." The sentence hung in the air like a piano note, soft and firm. When it was Ethan's turn, the silence grew even denser. He stood up, his cane resting beside him, and positioned himself in the illuminated strip. "I spent years controlling every detail, hiding what I couldn't control. But life came in through a 4-centimeter crack." Grace's breath caught in her chest. Ethan paused before continuing. "I'm not here to sell hope. I'm here to say that there is a territory between dark and less dark, and that it's worth walking through it." The journalists lowered their pens for a moment, as if just wanting to absorb it. Nora asked only one question, almost respectfully. "Why now?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because fear is heavy, and carrying it alone for so many years costs more than any headline." Evan smiled, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Today, we're opening the curtains, a little more than 4 centimeters. It was the first time the room laughed spontaneously, breaking the tension. Even Marcus, in the corner, allowed himself a discreet smile, a rare sign that he understood the importance of that moment. The statement was published a few hours later in a short and precise text. It didn't speak of miracles or cures. It spoke of process, of sensory routine, of neuroplasticity. It spoke of how every small advance was celebrated, of how the morning light had become part of the therapy. Within hours, the post was shared thousands of times. Instead of tabloids, the comments came from scientists, physical therapists, and families of people with visual impairments. "It's inspiring without being sensationalistic," Nora wrote in her article, published the next day. "It's human." Back at the lake house, the twins sat on the porch to listen to the wind. The city seemed far away, the pressures even farther. Grace brought tea and sat beside them, feeling the warmth of the sun touch her face. "You did something big today," she said. Evan answered first. "Not big, right." Ethan nodded. "We let the world in, but without letting it define who we are." The sound of the wind chimes responded like a chorus of approval. As evening fell, Evan went to the piano and played First Dawn again, but this time the melody seemed lighter, almost celebratory. Ethan remained standing near the window and didn't ask to close the curtain when night fell. "Let the moonlight in," he said, almost smiling. Grace felt a shiver. This house, once a fortress, now seemed to breathe along with them. The morning after the announcement, Grace woke before everyone and walked through the house alone. The floor was still cold under her bare feet. The air smelled of damp wood and fresh coffee. She stopped in front of the living room window and waited for the system to open the curtain. The light entered in a perfect line, striping the floor. For a moment, she remembered the first time she thought about pulling that curtain in secret, and smiled. 4 centimeters, she murmured. It was impossible to believe something so small had triggered such a great transformation. Evan appeared soon after, barefoot, his hair messy, and sat in the strip of light as if it were a morning ritual. "Sleep well?" he asked. Grace nodded. "As if the house were lighter." Evan smiled. "It is. So are we." Shortly after, Ethan entered, his cane resting casually on his shoulder, as if it were no longer a shield, but just an extension of his body. He stood in the light for a few seconds, absorbing the warmth rising from the floor, and said simply, "Leave it." It wasn't an order, it was consent, an acknowledgement that the day could come in. The house was alive in a new way. The sound of the chimes was a reminder of direction, not confinement. The wind brought stories. The aroma of coffee signaled it was time to begin. Even the silence had gained texture. It was no longer a void, but a space full of possibilities. Grace took a deep breath and felt that, somehow, she had also learned to see in a different way, not with her eyes, but with attention. With every detail, every micro-tension overcome, she too had been transformed. At the end of the afternoon, when they all gathered on the porch, Evan brought the portable piano and played First Dawn. The melody danced in the air along with the sound of the lake. Ethan stood beside his brother, eyes closed, feeling each note as if it were a new map forming within him. Grace looked at the two of them and felt her heart swell. These men, who once lived in a fortress of darkness, had now opened a crack, and for the first time, they were letting the light tell part of their story. Before leaving the lake house to return to her routine in Chicago, Grace took one last walk through the house. She touched the doorframe, felt the wood warmed by the sun, heard the distant sound of the chimes. She smiled as she realized she no longer had the urge to move anything in secret, because now nothing needed to be hidden. Everything was in its place, but nothing was the same. In the car, on the way to the city, she found herself thinking about how life is made of small gestures: a hung chime, an opened curtain, a cup of coffee at the right moment. Small decisions that seem insignificant, but together have the power to change destinies. Maybe that's what they call a miracle, she thought. Not something that falls from the sky, but something that is built day after day. When the story was officially published weeks later, the headline didn't speak of a cure or restored vision. It spoke of perception, and that's what touched thousands of people. Grace read the comments that came from all over the world, people telling their own 4 centimeters of light, their small, invisible victories, and felt that the work was complete. Not because the journey had ended, but because now it could continue without her. And for those watching that story on YouTube, the invitation was inevitable. And you? What's the curtain you need to open? What is the sound, the wind, or the light you're ignoring in your own life? Maybe today is the day to open a crack and let something new in. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving only the sound of the wind chimes, as if the viewer, too, were standing on the porch, listening to the world outside. If this video touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every day, you'll find real stories that warm the heart and organize the mind to inspire practical decisions in your daily life. And I invite you to the next video on the end screen, The Boy Who Didn't Speak and Became a Lecturer, a journey of voice, courage, and new beginnings. Click there and come with me. The night may be dark, but we always find a star when we decide to look up.